Close your eyes and imagine this. It's 10:47 p.m. on a cold February night in 1978. You're driving through the Sierra Nevada mountains, and your headlights cut through the darkness like a knife. The snow is falling harder now, and you can barely see the road ahead. Your car radio crackles with static. You're lost, confused, and terrified. Now imagine you're not alone. You're with your 4 best friends, the only people in the world who truly understand you. But something has gone horribly wrong. The simple drive home from a basketball game has turned into a nightmare that will haunt investigators for decades. You're about to hear the story of 5 friends who vanish into these very mountains, leaving behind one of the most baffling mysteries in American criminal history. But here's what makes this case so disturbing. They didn't just disappear. They were found. And what happened to them is far more terrifying than any murder, any kidnapping, any crime you can imagine, because sometimes the most horrifying mysteries aren't about who did it. They're about why 5 intelligent young men, when faced with survival, made choices that defied all logic and led to their deaths. They're about how the human mind can become our greatest enemy, and how terror can make us our own worst predators. Picture this. 5 friends, inseparable since they'd met playing basketball together, driving home from a game on a cold February night in 1978. The heater hums softly in their turquoise and white Mercury. They're laughing, probably still talking about the game they just watched, maybe planning their next tournament. In a few hours, they'd all be tucked safely in their beds, ready for another day. But that's not what happened. Instead, these 5 men would vanish into the Sierra Nevada mountains, leaving behind questions that still torment investigators today. Questions like, why would 5 friends abandon a perfectly working car in the middle of nowhere? Why would they walk 20 miles through a blizzard to find shelter, then refuse to use the heat or food that could have saved their lives? And why, when searchers called out their names in the darkness, did they turn off their flashlights and hide? The answers will challenge everything you think you know about human behavior, survival instincts, and the power of the mind to create realities more terrifying than any external threat. These weren't hardened outdoorsmen or experienced hikers. They were gentle souls, each living with intellectual disabilities that made them see the world a little differently than most of us. Their families called them the boys, and they stuck together like brothers. They had routines, safe patterns, predictable lives. They never took risks. They never wandered off alone. So how did they end up 70 miles from home, deep in a frozen wilderness? In the middle of a blizzard? How did 5 men who never broke rules, never deviated from their careful routines, end up making decisions that would cost them everything? Let me take you back to that February evening, to a basketball court in Chico, California, where our story begins with cheering crowds and the sound of sneakers squeaking on polished wood. Because to understand what happened in those mountains, we first need to understand who these 5 men really were. Gary was the unofficial leader of the group, despite being the youngest at just 25. He'd served in the army, stationed in Germany, where something had gone terribly wrong. Picture a young soldier, far from home, struggling with pressures he couldn't understand or control. The stress, the isolation, maybe something deeper had triggered a mental break. Schizophrenia, the doctors said when he returned home. But Gary had fought back. He'd clawed his way out of psychiatric hospitals, survived suicide attempts, and rebuilt his life one day at a time. By 1978, he was what a psychiatrist proudly called one of our brilliant success stories. The medication was working. He was stable, functional, even hopeful about the future. He supplemented his disability payments by working in his stepfather's landscaping business, and he'd found something precious: friendship. Ted was a gentle giant of the group, standing well over 6 feet, but possessing the heart of a child. At 32, he still lived with his parents, content with his simple routines and his love of basketball. He never hurt anyone, never raised his voice, never caused trouble. Those who knew him described him as someone who saw only good in the world, who trusted everyone he met with the innocence of a child. Madruga was the group's designated driver, careful and responsible with his prize Mercury. He'd saved for months to buy that car, and he treated it like a treasured possession, quiet and intelligent. He was the type who observed more than he spoke, who thought carefully before acting. His mother would later say he was so cautious with his car that he'd never take it on unfamiliar roads, especially not in bad weather. Hewitt, just 24, was pure sweetness, the kind of person who made everyone around him smile. He lived in Olivehurst with his parents, and his greatest joy was spending time with his 4 friends. He was the heart of the group, the one who brought laughter and lightness to their gatherings. And Bill, 29 years old, athletic and energetic, was the group's bowling enthusiast. When he wasn't playing basketball with his friends, you could find him at the local lanes, perfecting his technique. He was competitive in a way that only someone who'd found their passion could be, and he dreamed of improving his game enough to join a league. These 5 had found each other through a local program for people with disabilities, bonding over their shared love of sports. They played on a team called the Gateway Gators, and basketball wasn't just a game to them. It was everything. It was community, purpose, identity. Their families would tell you that when the boys got together, it was always about sports. Playing it, watching it, living it. But there was something else that bound them together. Trust. In a world that often treated them as less than capable, they'd found in each other a safe space where they could be themselves without judgment. Gary could talk about his struggles with mental illness. Ted could be gentle without being mocked. Madruga and Hewitt could be quiet and thoughtful without being called slow. Bill could be enthusiastic without being told to calm down. They were more than friends. They were each other's sanctuary. If you believe stories like this should be told, consider liking, commenting, and subscribing. On February 24th, 1978, they had plans. Big plans. The next day, their team was supposed to play in a week-long tournament sponsored by the Special Olympics. They'd been training for months, and the prize was something that filled them with childlike excitement. Tickets to Disneyland. Can you imagine? 5 grown men, dreaming of meeting Mickey Mouse and riding Space Mountain, planning their adventure with the pure joy that most of us lose in childhood. But first, they wanted to support another team. UC Davis was playing a away game against Chico State that Friday night, and the boys decided to make the 50-mile drive north to cheer them on. It will be fun, they figured, a little adventure before their big tournament. The plan was simple. Drive to Chico, watch the game, maybe grab a bite to eat, then drive home. They'd done similar trips before. Gary had his medication. Ted had told his parents he'd be home by midnight. Madruga had checked his car. Oil, gas, tires, everything in perfect condition. Hewitt had brought snacks for the road. Bill had his lucky shirt, the one he always wore to games. Everything was normal. Everything was safe. Everything was exactly the way it should be. Madruga carefully loaded his 4 friends into his Mercury Montego that Friday evening. Despite the cold February air in Northern California, none of them wore heavy coats, just light jackets. After all, they'd be inside for the game and then back in the warm car for the drive home. The weather report had mentioned possible snow in the mountains, but they weren't going to the mountains. They were going to Chico, then straight home. The drive to Chico was uneventful. They probably listened to the radio, talked about the upcoming tournament, maybe made jokes about which rides they'd go on first at Disneyland. Gary might have talked about his job, how proud he was to be earning money and contributing to the family business. Ted might have mentioned his parents' plans for his birthday next month. Madruga and Hewitt might have discussed their favorite basketball plays. Bill might have talked about his latest bowling scores. Just 5 friends, driving through the night, heading toward what should have been a simple, joyful evening. The game was everything they'd hoped for. UC Davis 184-75, and our 5 friends cheered and celebrated like the victory was their own. You could imagine them in those stands, clapping and shouting, sharing that pure joy that comes from watching your team succeed. They high-fived strangers, bought overpriced concession stand snacks, and felt like they were part of something bigger than themselves. This is important to remember. At this point in our story, everything was still normal. They were happy, excited, looking forward to tomorrow's tournament. There was no indication that anything was wrong, no sign of the tragedy that was about to unfold. After the game, they made one stop. Bears Market, a convenience store in downtown Chico. The clerk would later remember them clearly, not because anything seemed wrong, but because they'd arrived just before closing time at 10 p.m. 5 grown men buying candy, milk, and snacks, chatting excitedly about the game they'd just watched. The clerk, a young woman eager to close up shop and go home, was irritated. She wanted to count the till, lock up, and get out of there. And here was this large group, taking their time, counting out exact change, making small talk about basketball. She tapped her foot impatiently as they gathered their purchases and headed back out into the cold night air. That interaction, those few minutes of mild annoyance over a delayed closing, would later take on enormous significance, because it was the last time anyone would see all 5 men alive and acting normally. That was 10 p.m. on February 24th, 1978. Now, here's where our story takes its first strange turn. The drive from Bears Market back to Yuba City should have taken about an hour. Highway 99 south, then Highway 70 west. A route they'd taken before, a route Madruga knew well. They should have been home by 11:30 p.m., in their own beds by midnight. But that's not what happened. Instead, somewhere between leaving that parking lot and arriving home, 5 friends made a decision that would cost them everything. They turned their car away from the familiar highways, away from the warm lights of home, and drove deep into the Sierra Nevada mountains. Imagine their families that night. Gary's parents, probably not worried yet. After all, Gary was with his friends, and they always looked out for each other. Ted's mother, glancing at the clock and wondering if she should wait up. Madruga's family, trusting their responsible son to get everyone home safely. Hewitt's parents, confident that their sweet boy was in good hands. Bill's family, already planning to hear about the game over breakfast. But morning came, and the boys didn't. Phone calls started early. Have you heard from Ted? Is Gary home? Madruga's car is in the driveway. By noon, the worry had turned to panic. By evening, the families had contacted the police. These weren't the kind of young men who stayed out all night without calling. They had responsibilities, routines, that tournament the next day. They would never just disappear. Something was wrong. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. The police launched a search. But where do you look for 5 missing men who could be anywhere within hundreds of miles? They checked hospitals, morgues, jails. They contacted other police departments. They interviewed the clerk at Bears Market, who confirmed that the boys had been there, but seemed perfectly normal. The hours ticked by. The Gateway Gators tournament began without them. The tickets to Disneyland sat unused. 5 families held their breath and prayed for a miracle. The answer came 4 days later, in a place so unexpected, so far from where they should have been, that it only deepened the mystery. A search team found Madruga's Mercury Montego on February 28th, but not where anyone expected. The car was 70 miles from home, deep in the Plumas National Forest, sitting on a remote mountain road called Oroville-Quincy Road. This wasn't just off the beaten path. It was in the middle of nowhere, accessible only by a dirt track that most people didn't even know existed. Snow surrounded the vehicle, But here's what made investigators stop and scratch their heads. The car was in perfect working condition. The engine turned over on the first try. The gas tank was nearly full. The battery was fine. The tires had good tread. If the car had gotten stuck in the snow, it could have easily been pushed free by 5 grown men working together. Instead, it sat there abandoned, windows rolled down despite the freezing temperatures, with candy wrappers and milk cartons scattered on the seats, evidence of their stop at Bears Market. Maps were spread across the dashboard, as if someone had been trying to figure out where they were. But there was no sign of the 5 men who'd been inside. The location of the car raised immediate questions. How had they ended up here? The Oroville-Quincy Road wasn't on any direct route between Chico and Yuba City. In fact, it was in completely the wrong direction. To get there from Bears Market, they would have had to drive north instead of south, then turn east into the mountains, a journey that made no sense at all. Had they gotten lost? It was possible, but unlikely. Madruga knew the area reasonably well, and even if they'd taken a wrong turn, why would they continue driving deeper into the mountains instead of turning around? The road they were on dead-ended at a ranger station miles ahead. It clearly wasn't going anywhere useful. Had they been following someone? Meeting someone? Running from someone? The questions multiplied, but the answers remained elusive. The search for the 5 men intensified. Helicopters swept the snowy forest. Ground teams combed through the wilderness, calling their names. Search dogs followed scent trails that led nowhere. Days turned into weeks, and still nothing. The snow was deep, the terrain unforgiving, and 5 men with intellectual disabilities seemed to have vanished into thin air. As winter slowly gave way to spring, the families held on to hope. Maybe the boys had found shelter. Maybe they were waiting for the snow to melt. Maybe they'd walk out of those mountains any day now with a story of survival that would make headlines. But hope is a fragile thing, and with each passing day, it grew harder to maintain. Then June arrived, and with it, a discovery that would haunt everyone involved in this case for the rest of their lives. As the snow melted, revealing a landscape that had been hidden for months, a group of motorcyclists made a grisly find. Deep in the forest, about 20 miles north of where the car had been abandoned, they discovered some portable buildings used by Forest Service firefighting crews. The structures were supposed to be empty during the off-season, but something was wrong. One of the windows was broken. When they peered inside, the smell hit them immediately, the unmistakable odor of death. Inside, they found Ted. But the scene that greeted investigators defied every assumption they'd made about what happened that night. Ted's body lay on a bed, carefully wrapped in multiple blankets, as if someone had been trying to keep him comfortable. He'd lost nearly 100 pounds from his already thin frame and died of starvation and exposure. The coroner estimated he'd lived for 8 to 13 weeks after the group's disappearance, meaning he'd survived most of the winter in that trailer before finally succumbing. But here's what made no sense. The trailer was stocked enough canned food to feed several people for months. Sea rations, soup, vegetables, meat, a survival cache that could have sustained Ted and his friends until spring. There was a propane heater in perfect working condition. There were warm clothes, blankets, tools, everything needed for survival. Yet Ted had slowly starved to death, wrapped in blankets like a child being tucked in for the night, surrounded by the very resources that could have saved him. His boots were missing. Investigators found them outside the trailer, neatly placed as if he'd removed them before going inside. But there was something else that made their blood run cold. Gary's shoes, left behind in the trailer. Gary's shoes, but no Gary. The discovery of Ted's body was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, searchers found the remains of the other missing men scattered across the wilderness. Madruga and Bill were discovered along a forest road, about 5 miles from the abandoned car. Only bones remained, picked clean by scavengers. Hugh was found in a wooded area, about a mile from where Ted had died. His own father, desperate for answers, had joined the search team and made that heartbreaking discovery himself. But Gary was nowhere to be found. Not then, not ever. As investigators tried to piece together what had happened, they kept running into the same impossible questions. Why had these 5 men, who never took risks, never went on adventures, driven 70 miles in the wrong direction into a mountain wilderness? Why had they abandoned a perfectly working car? Why, when they'd found shelter and supplies, had they failed to use them? The timeline they reconstructed was deeply disturbing. Based on the evidence, it appeared that all 5 men had somehow made it from the abandoned car to the trailer where Ted was found, a journey of nearly 20 miles through rugged, snow-covered terrain. They'd been wearing only light jackets, street shoes, and jeans. The temperature that night dropped well below freezing, and snow was falling heavily. How had they survived that trek? How had they even known where to go? The trailer wasn't visible from the road, and there were no signs or markers indicating its location. Someone would have had to know it was there, or stumble upon it by pure chance. But the most disturbing question was this. If they'd all made it to the trailer, why had they died? Why hadn't they used the heater, the food, the shelter that was right there? And then there was the witness. A local man named Joseph Shones came forward with a story that added an even more sinister dimension to the mystery. Shones claimed he'd spent that same night stranded in his own car, not far from where the mercury was found. He'd been driving home from a basketball game. Ironically, the same game our 5 friends had attended, when his car had broken down. Shones told police a story that made investigators' skin crawl. He'd seen and heard people moving around in the darkness near his vehicle. Twice, he called out for help, thinking maybe they could assist each other in the harsh conditions. But instead of responding, the figures had gone silent and turned off their flashlights, as if they were hiding from him. He described hearing voices, seeing lights moving through the trees, but whenever he tried to make contact, everything went quiet. It was as if whoever was out there was deliberately avoiding him, staying just out of reach. Was this our 5 friends, scared and confused in the darkness? Or was someone else out there that night, someone who didn't want to be seen or identified? The distance between the abandoned car and the trailer where Ted died raised even more troubling questions. 20 miles through rugged, snow-covered terrain. Could 5 men with intellectual disabilities have made that journey on foot in a blizzard wearing only light jackets? Some investigators began to suspect foul play. Maybe the boys had been forced to drive to that remote location. Maybe they'd been threatened by someone who'd made them too terrified to eat the food or use the heater, convincing them it was somehow dangerous. But there was another theory, one that focused on Gary and his fragile mental state. A theory that would prove to be both the most logical and the most terrifying explanation of all. Gary had schizophrenia, a condition that can cause paranoid delusions so vivid and convincing that they become absolutely real to the person experiencing them. What if Gary had suffered a psychotic break that night? What if he'd become convinced that they were being pursued, that danger lurked around every corner, that the food was poisoned or the heater would give away their location to some imaginary threat? Mental health professionals who studied the case pointed out that paranoid delusions in schizophrenia can be incredibly specific and persistent. Gary might have believed that someone was hunting them, that they were in immediate danger, that any sign of their presence would lead to capture or death. The witness who'd seen figures moving in the darkness, turning off their flashlights when he called out. What if those were our 5 friends, so terrified by Gary's delusions that they were trying to remain invisible, even potential rescuers? Gary was the leader, the one the others looked up to and followed. If he'd been in the grip of a paranoid delusion, could he convince his trusting friends that they needed to hide, to stay quiet, to avoid anything that might attract attention? It would explain everything. The abandoned car, still running but left behind as if they fled from some perceived danger. The impossible trek through the mountains, driven by the belief that they were being pursued. The refusal to use a heater or food, convinced that these things were somehow dangerous or will reveal their location. Think about it. 5 men huddled in that trailer, convinced by their trusted friend that they were in mortal danger. Every sound in the darkness would have been confirmation of their fears. Every car passing on the distant road would have been evidence that they were still looking. And the food in the trailer? In the grip of paranoid delusion, Gary might have been convinced it was planted there, poisoned, or somehow contaminated. The heater might have seemed like a beacon, advertising their location to their imaginary pursuers. But this theory raises perhaps the most disturbing question of all. If Gary was experiencing such severe paranoid delusions, where's his body? Some experts believe Gary might have wandered off during the final days, his delusions driving him deeper into the wilderness. Others think he may have died first, and his absence somehow broke the spell that kept the others paralyzed by fear. There's another possibility, one that investigators don't like to discuss, but can't entirely dismiss. What if Gary's delusions weren't entirely imaginary? What if there really was someone out there that night, someone who'd been following them, threatening them, making Gary's paranoid fears seem justified? The more you examine this case, the more you realize that every answer leads to more questions. Every theory, no matter how logical it seems, eventually crumbles under the weight of contradictory evidence. Consider the hitchhiker theory. Madruga's mother, Melba, always believed her son might have picked up a stranger on the road. He was kind-hearted, the type who'd help anyone in need. Maybe someone had flagged them down, claimed their car had broken down, asked for a ride to the next town. But if that were true, why drive 70 miles in the wrong direction? Why abandon the car in perfect working condition? Why would a hitchhiker want to lead 5 men into the wilderness to die? Unless the hitchhiker wasn't just looking for a ride. Unless they had darker intentions. Some investigators explored the possibility that the boys had encountered someone with criminal motives. Maybe they'd been robbed, then forced to drive to a remote location to prevent them from identifying their attacker. Maybe they'd been left there to die, with threats that kept them too terrified to use the resources that could have saved them. But this theory, too, has problems. There was no evidence of violence on the bodies, no signs of struggle in the car. The boys had money in their wallets, watches on their wrists. If robbery was the motive, why leave these things behind? Then there's a local rumor that refuses to die. Whispers about a town bully who dated Gary's sister, who'd harbored a grudge against Gary for years. According to this theory, this man and possibly an accomplice had followed the boys that night, harassing them, threatening them, eventually driving them into the mountains where they'd been left to survive on their own. But investigators could never find solid evidence to support this theory. The alleged bully had an alibi. There were no witnesses who'd seen him that night. It remains just another tantalizing possibility in a case full of them. As the months passed and the investigation stalled, the families of the 5 men were left to grapple with an impossible grief. They'd lost their sons, brothers, friends, but they'd never truly understand how or why. Ted's family mourned the gentle giant who'd never hurt anyone, who died alone and afraid in that cold trailer. They couldn't understand why he hadn't used the food, the heat, the resources that could have saved him. Had he been too scared? Too confused? Too loyal to friends who'd told him not to? Bill's family remembered the athletic young man who'd loved bowling and laughter. They pictured him trudging through the snow, following his friends wherever they led, trusting them even when logic screamed that they were going the wrong way. Hewitt's family grieved for their sweet, loving son who brought joy to everyone he met. They couldn't comprehend how someone so innocent, so trusting, had ended up dying alone in those terrible woods. Madruga's family lost their careful, responsible son who'd been so proud of his Mercury, who'd never have abandoned it unless something terrible had forced his hand. They knew he would have tried to take care of his friends, would have tried to get them home safely. What had gone so wrong? And Gary's family faced the cruelest fate of all. Their son, brother, friend had simply vanished. No body, no closure, no final goodbye. Just questions that would haunt them forever. In the years that followed, the case would capture the attention of true crime enthusiasts, investigators, and amateur sleuths from around the world. Everyone had a theory. Everyone was certain they'd found the missing piece of the puzzle. Some believed the boys had been victims of a serial killer, someone who perfected the art of psychological torture. Others thought they'd encountered a cult or group of people living off the grid in the mountains. A few even suggested they'd witnessed something they shouldn't have, something that made them targets. But perhaps the most unsettling theory of all is the simplest one, that sometimes terrible things happen for no reason at all. That 5 friends can leave for a basketball game on a Friday night and never come home, and despite our desperate need to make sense of it, to find someone to blame, to uncover the truth, sometimes the truth is just that chaos is real and tragedy can strike anyone, anywhere, anytime. The case officially remains unsolved. Gary Mathias is still listed as a missing person, though nearly 50 years have passed. The Plumas National Forest has given up its other secrets over the decades, but Gary's final resting place remains hidden. Every winter, when the snow falls heavy in the Sierra Nevada mountains, some people think about the Yuba County Five. They wonder if Gary's remains are still out there, waiting to be discovered. They picture 5 friends, lost and afraid, making decisions that would cost them everything. But here's what we know for certain. Theodore Edward Weiher, William Sterling, Jack Madruga, and Jackie Hewitt were more than just victims in a true crime story. They were sons and brothers, friends and teammates. They had dreams and hopes, routines and relationships that mattered to them. Ted, who wrapped himself in blankets like a child seeking comfort, had spent his life bringing gentle kindness to everyone around him. Bill, who died on that frozen mountain road, had been an athlete who found joy in simple pleasures. Madruga, who'd driven his friends to that basketball game in his beloved Mercury, had been a responsible young man who took care of the people he loved. Hewitt, whose own father would find his body in those terrible woods, had been the heart of the group, the one who made everyone smile. And Gary, wherever he is, had been fighting his own battles long before that February night. He'd been a success story, a young man who'd overcome mental illness to build a life surrounded by friends who accepted him exactly as he was. The tragedy of the Yuba County Five isn't just that they died. It's that they died afraid, confused, and alone, far from the families who loved them and the routines that gave their lives meaning. It's that despite having shelter, food, and warmth within reach, something, whether delusion, threat, or terror, kept them from saving themselves. But maybe that's the real lesson of this case. Maybe the horror isn't in the unanswered questions or the mysterious circumstances. Maybe it's in the recognition that we're all just one wrong turn, one bad decision, one moment of panic away from tragedy. Maybe it's an understanding that the mind, our most powerful tool for survival, can also become our greatest enemy. As you drive through the mountains of Northern California today, past the signs of Plumas National Forest, remember that somewhere in those woods, 5 friends faced their final hours together. Remember that they were more than just a mystery to be solved. They were human beings whose lives had value, whose deaths leave a hole in the world that can never be filled. And the next time you're driving home from a night out with friends, laughing and planning tomorrow's adventures, remember how precious and fragile those moments are. Remember that sometimes the only thing standing between us and unthinkable tragedy is luck, timing, and the simple grace of making it home safely. Close your eyes one more time. It's 10:47 p.m. on a cold February night in 1978. You're driving through the Sierra Nevada mountains, and your headlights cut through the darkness like a knife. But this time, you're not alone and you're not afraid. You're with people who love you. People would follow you anywhere, trust you with anything. That trust is a beautiful thing. But it's also dangerous, because sometimes the people we love most can lead us into the darkness, and our loyalty to them can become the very thing that destroys us. The heater hums softly. The road stretches ahead in the darkness. And somewhere in the night, 5 friends are still driving toward a destiny none of them could have imagined, their laughter echoing through time, a reminder that every goodbye might be the last one, and every safe arrival home is a small miracle we should never take for granted.